Let's talk more about ChatGPT.
Welcome back to another episode of the Thought Bistro. Today we have a very special guest here with us. This is Hemil Desai, all the way from California. Hemil, why don't you introduce yourself? I think you'll do a better job than either of us.
Hi everyone, I'm Hemil. I'm so excited to be here with Akhil and Vishrut to talk about chatbots. As Vishrut mentioned, I'm currently in California. I'm working as a software engineer at Snap, where I'm working on their machine learning platform. Basically, what I do is I help engineers to train models to recommend different kinds of stories or advertisements to users.
So I think if we had to put it in a way, he is by far and away amongst the three of us the biggest expert we have on chatbots, AI, and the works. So we thought after all of you were so interested with ChatGPT and the ChatGPT episode, why not get him on and get a deeper understanding of what exactly goes on behind the scenes, how things work, what is the history, and some of the stuff that's cropped up since we did our last episode.
I am also an enthusiast with the recent developments that are happening in the AI world, and I'm trying to do my best to follow these developments and learn about how these things work. I'll try to mention things which I'm sure of, or things which I'm just trying to learn, and hopefully that sets a good baseline.
So, Himil, why don't you start us off about a little bit of the history of what is happening now? Like, we hear about it now and we are just wowed by it. I'm sure there is something that got us to this point.
Neural networks, which are the latest technology that is being used to train these amazing models that you see today, have been around for a long time, say like around 1950s, 1960s, maybe. They picked up some traction in the 1990s, where there was a very famous model that could recognize handwritten digits. But then the traction slowly died down until the last decade, where we saw kind of like a revolution. You can compare it to the internet. That's a little far-fetched comparison, but for me, it was pretty exciting in the sense that in 2012, there was a competition called ImageNet, which is basically you are given a bunch of images and you have to identify what is the object in each of those images. So the image has a dog, you have to identify it as a dog, and so on. Basically, the neural net that entered the competition in 2012 was called AlexNet, and it was able to beat the competition by a huge margin of 10 to 15%. And that was like the defining point or a starting point in the revolution, because everyone now started looking at this and saying that, yes, this is powerful, and we're going to use this to do variety of different things, from like image classification to like text classification to making bots that can play games and etc. Once the entire like machine learning research community started working on these neural networks, the progress never stopped. And a decade from now, in 2022, last year, we saw these amazing new kind of revolutions in the form of ChatGPT and Stable Diffusion, which address two different domains.
You may have heard our last episode about what ChatGPT is. And if you have not, I really would advise you to go back to that episode to understand a little deeper. For our listeners who may not be aware of the concept of Stable Diffusion is one of these text to images softwares. So in Stable Diffusion, if you come up with a text such as, I want to see a monkey sitting on a chair, it will just generate the image of a monkey sitting on a chair. And, it's easy to think about artists just making whatever is in their head and you making something by just texting it out. We might have another whole discussion on Stable Diffusion and DALI as a different topic to a different conversation some other day. But this is just for context.
That was the starting point in 2012. After that, we come to around 2018 or something. I'm not sure about the exact year, but there was a very famous paper called Attention is All You Need, which introduced kind of like the technique that is used to train these language models like ChatGPT that you see today. And that picked up a lot in the community. Nowadays, we've standardized on that technique. It's called self-attention, and the model, like kind of like the architecture of the model is called transformers. And that is universally used across most of the language models that you see today. And it's even used in like most of the image models. So I guess for the user that are interacting directly with the system, like ChatGPT or Stable Diffusion to generate images, this transformer model is kind of what's underneath. And after that, what happened is that kind of the size of the models and the size of the data and the size of the compute kept on growing and growing and growing. And we reached the stage of GPT-3, which was trained by OpenAI, which has 175 billion parameters. So all these like big models are for natural language are termed as large language models. So that was kind of the first or like the first large language model released to the public. After that, large language model forms the basis of ChatGPT. So let's talk in simple terms what this large language model does. So what this model does is consider it as a black box. You feed in a bunch of text. Let's say, what is your name? And it takes that text, generates context, internal representation of that text. It generates the sentence word by word or token by token. So when you feed in what's your name, it will try to generate something like my name is GPT-3 and I am a language model trained by OpenAI. So that's kind of the base or like what this black box large language model does.
I think Google completely transformed their strategy sometime in the early, like a decade ago, when they started putting everything on their assistant. And when you ask Google Assistant that, what's your name? It says, I am Google Assistant. And when you ask Google Assistant for tell me a joke, it gives me a joke, right? And even Google Lens has become like such a major topic of discussion, because you get your phone out, take a picture, it tells you what it is. Get your phone out, take a picture of like an area, and it tells you where that area is, right? So what would be like a difference between something like a ChatGPT, GPT 3.5, and that of Google Lens or Google Assistant?
So for Google Lens, it's a completely different domain, images. The GPT model doesn't deal with images. It just deals with like natural text or language, I would say. In terms of Google Assistant, the very first like Google Assistant or Siri that came out, that kind of there's two steps to it, right? The first you speak into the assistant or you talk to the assistants. So it like none of them like directly operates on speech or audio, I'm assuming. So first step is to kind of convert that audio into text. And once you have that text, you feed it into the black box, right? So the first black box that were developed were not as powerful as the large language models of today. So they did, let's say, like a decision tree, right? They tried to get the context from what you speak to it. Like, what if you speak, what is your name? It gets the context that is asking for name, and then you have like some sort of a small, like specialized rule-based system or a model that will respond to it, saying that this is, hi, I'm an assistant. Or if you say what is the weather, then it'll go to that branch and say get me the latest weather. And then like there's a catch all, right? So if you say something that the assistant is not capable of answering, then it'll just say like I can't answer this, search this on Google or something like that, right? So that was like the initial start of it. There are some models being used that as well, but what this large language models paved the way for is to take all those different heuristics and those kind of branches and then just replace it with this chat GPT or GPT 3.5 or Google's internal models. And then you don't need to have this special layering or branching, and then just one model can answer all your questions or most of the questions that you have. So I'm assuming at this stage, Google Assistant is also using some sort of large language model underneath to kind of get most of its answers. But that's how it started, right? And then you kind of kept developing, and then you reach this point of these large models, which are intelligent enough to answer most of the questions that a human might have.
I feel like it's pretty phenomenal what is happening and how our lives have just transitioned into assistant being such a major part of our life, right? So We talk about the small Google speaker that we keep in our houses, and everything now is done with that Google speaker or with that Apple Pod, which really didn't work out for anybody. Let's not talk about Apple. With that Alexa thing, right? And everybody's just like, Alexa, get me an Uber, and it gets them an Uber. Like, Google, do this for me. It's like you have servants sitting in your house while not having servants sitting in your house. It's a nice build up towards what is happening.
Yeah, I think all the way from what started as something where you could just play music on, or have fun with your friends trying to do, like, tell me a joke and things like that, has now turned into a thing that controls every part of your life, from your lights in your room to your air conditioner to your water heater to everything goes through an assistant. Everything is, your smart home, as they call it.
And the phenomenal part about this must be the language recognition. Am I correct, Hemil? Because understanding human language as is, we've done a little bit of coding, and in that code, you have to be like really specific and really have the minute details set. But with things like Google, ChatGPT, these things, we're just like talking to it like we would talk to a human being.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing because if you try to like build a system that even says, let's say if you're trying to build a simple system, when a user asks it what's the weather, you get the latest weather. But there's so many ways to ask what's the weather. You cannot like just type down all the different ways a human can ask to get the weather. And it's like without these models, it's just like think about 20 years ago when people were trying to, if you're trying to build like a Siri or Google Assistant or something, and it's just so difficult and the opportunities are just so limited that then you can realize the power of these language models and the capabilities that it has, and the things that it can do today are really amazing and really interesting to learn about for a curious mind.
So if I ask you a further question, it would be that now that Google Assistant has been here for 5, 6 years, 7 years, when I try to display the capability of ChatGPT to somebody, then my ordinary queries can just get so far. And they ask me, how is it that different from a Google generated answer? So let's delve into how it really works and where the differences arise, and how is this much more special than what has been happening.
I left my last thought at large language models, for instance, OpenAI's GPT-3 or 3.5, which forms the basis for ChatGPT. Now, to give a brief overview of how these large language models are trained, is that you get all the data, all the text data that you can possibly find on the internet, like all Reddit posts, all Twitter posts, all Wikipedia articles, all blog posts, and you get all that. And what you do is very simple. Let's say you have a blog post, right? You kind of take the first sentence, you feed it into the model and try to predict what comes next. And you already have then what comes next, right? So that kind of forms the basis of your training. You see the output it generates, and you kind of like tune it to get as close to the real output as you can. And this kind of generalizes then because the model is so large and the data is so large. After that, when the model is trained, you ask it something, and based on that representation, it forms the most probable answer that you can get, right? So this is the large language model. Now, ChatGPT, what it is it is optimized for conversations with humans. OpenAI here uses a technique called reinforcement learning for human feedback. Let's say you generate a list of conversations that humans might have, and you train another smaller language model that kind of gives scores to these conversations. If you ask, what is the medicine to take if you have a fever? You have a response from a doctor, which is higher scored. You have response from some normal person, which is lower scored. And then based on those scores, you can get another smaller black box. When you feed it in a conversation, it outputs a score. So that is known as the reward model. So you take this reward model, and then you take ChatGPT, which is called the agent, and you feed it in a bunch of like prompts to the conversation, right? And then it produces responses. These responses are produced by the GPT-3 agent. The responses are then fed to the smaller reward model that we talked about, and it outputs a score. And based on that score, the original GPT-3 is optimized for the purpose of human conversations. And then after that training process is complete, you get ChatGPT.
If I had to simplify it, I don't know. I mean, a lot of that went over my head as well. So I'm just trying to, simplify things. Like, if you look at training a dog, for example, you train it to do a certain number of tricks, and then you get a third person in to then ask it to perform those particular tricks. And when, as and how the dog performs, you give it treats, or it doesn't get the specific treat if it doesn't perform the trick. So in essence, what you're saying is that the large language model at the start, which or based on which ChatGPT is trained, is the owner of the dog. And then this smaller black box that you're talking about, which then scores the dog, is the trainer or the third person who you call in to test the way the dog performs after a certain amount of training.
I've actually been teaching my nephew recently, and my nephew is like this little 4-year-old boy. And what I got was completely different, right? I didn't get like a reward model, even if it's called a reward model. It was like when he tries to write a G, right? And sometimes he writes the G inverted. So you slap his hand and you're like, write it correct. And then he'll squish it up a little bit. And then you slap his hand again, and then he'll try to write it correctly again. At the end of the day, when he finally gets it correct, you say, okay, this is right. And then the next time you ask him to write a G, he'll write the G correctly. So that's the kind of reinforcement model that I got from the conversation.
Yeah, that's the correct interpretation. And Vishrut, your analogy is also pretty good. But the only point I would like to differ with is that the large language model is actually the dog that is being reinforced. ChatGPT is kind of like the trained dog that is trained to have good quality conversations with humans. So yeah, at a high level, this is like kind of like the reinforcement learning kind of way. The internal details are obviously very complicated, and OpenAI actually haven't yet still released the like the research paper for ChatGPT. So there's just like the research community is trying to form like conclusions or like interpretations of how this works. But they're pretty excited and looking forward to the research paper when it will be finally released.
It is very interesting because in the past, Leonardo da Vinci, one of our very popular artists and one of our very popular engineers in Italy, he used to cut up animals and he used to try and make things out of the workings of animals. How does a bird fly? Maybe I can develop a plane model from that. How does a frog eat its fly, right? And based on that, he developed the model of a cannon. We keep seeing things in nature, how they work, and then us as human beings decided to learn how does a human being learn, and then we decided to understand, maybe we can teach a machine that processes just ones and zeros and make it learn like a human being and behave like a human being. And now we are at the stage where it's becoming indifferentiable from a human being. So do you think that this indifference, where does it play? What's its role in the future? And should we be scared of it in any manner?
So my thinking is that these models and AI systems will kind of aid humans to achieve their goals and kind of do it in the fastest way possible. I think over the course of history, people have always been scared of innovation in the short term, but in the long term, they've kind of tried to push like humanity forward, and humans have always adopted these tools to kind of be productive and do their best work. So I think this is how these AI systems will be used. Now there's a lot of ethical considerations of like system that might be as intelligent as humans, but we are not there yet. I wouldn't be scared. I would be excited to kind of use it to do my best work and kind of help me kind of learn more things. For example, if I'm time constrained, I want to get some information about a topic, or I want to go over a research paper, this system can help me answer questions of the research paper that I may have, or it can help me summarize a book that I want to read, or stuff like that. The applications are endless.
So talking about it as an aid to human beings, let's talk about it as an aid to you. You are dealing with such big data, and you are dealing with coding on a day-to-day life, and like coding at a level higher than most people would ever do in their lives, right? So I would love to know how it has helped you in making your work easier, making your work faster, and how it has aided you.
Or has it even helped you yet?
Yeah. I've been using ChatGPT a lot for my personal projects, actually. And also, there's another system by OpenAI and GitHub called Copilot, which assists specifically for coding. And I've been using that a lot as well for my personal projects. So, what this has helped me it is to cut down time on mundane, repetitive tasks and speed up my productivity in the sense that, let's say, I want to find a bunch of images that I've stored somewhere in my computer to kind of feed it into a machine learning model that I'm training, right? It's not always the case that I remember all the commands to kind of quickly find that, right? So without ChatGPT or Copilot, what I would do is I would go to Google, see how to find all these bunch of images in Mac OS, and then kind of browse through the answers, get the one that seems most reliable, try it out, see if it works. If it works, I'm lucky. If not, try the other answers and finally get to a point that it works. But now what this does is this entire system is replaced by me just asking ChatGPT that how do I find a bunch of images ending in .jpeg on my computer, and it gives me the answer. And most of the times it is pretty reliable. Sometimes it is not reliable, and then I have to do that feedback loop again. But most of the time it is pretty good from what I've found in my experience.
Essentially, what you're trying to say is that this allows you to enter more specific queries, I guess, because in on Google, oftentimes if you enter the entire error that you're having or like the very specific error that you're having, oftentimes the result that you get is not the one that you're looking for. You have to enter a little more generalized version and then do the trial and error. But in ChatGPT, you can enter exactly what's wrong and it'll give you the very personalized solution.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Basically, at each step of whatever like I do in terms of like coding or software engineering, it helps increase my productivity. And right now, it is not at the stage that where I can say that write this complete project for me, but it is at the stage where I can say that I've written this code, maybe write tests for it so that I don't have to write the unit test myself, and that saves a huge amount of time. And also the other examples I mentioned where it's not possible for a human to remember all the APIs or the different languages that you have, like in computer science, all the different kind of commands and so on. And what you do is you search, and this is like a shortcut for what you search or what you need to find.
So there are two things that I have to say, in response to that. Firstly, you say that okay, you can write the more menial things with ChatGPT or something similar. So now my question to you is, what about the people who have those menial jobs? Because we spoke about this last time as well. It's making us go beyond the generic, the menial, the repetitive. These things are going to be going out of our lives slowly and surely. So, with the number of people that we are on this planet, we're 8 billion of us. So, how enhanced are we going to get, or what is your take on this?
I think there can be like two ways. Like the short term way is that people that are using these tools or that are doing jobs such as like writing news articles or blog posts or something like that, they use the chat gpt tool to kind of overcome their writer's block or to give them ideas about how to continue their writing, or basically use it as an aid for their writing. A second point might be the case where chat gpt completely replaces these writers. So I think the first step is more likely in the short term. In the long term, I can't say for sure. I think no one can. But even if it does replace some of these tasks, then I'm sure, like based on from history, what we've seen is that people always develop skills that are necessary at that point in time and kind of evolve, enhance, and adopt, right? So in the short term, there is a negative effect on that particular group of people economically, but in the long term, it generally benefits.
So there was this very famous economist. His name was Henry Hazlitt. He's dead now. He wrote a book called Economics in One Lesson. And in that, he puts it very nicely. He says, the aim of a nation, the aim of a bunch of people should not be to create jobs. For example, he has a very nice example in there. He says, let's say I have to dig a hole and the hole needs to be 100 meter down and 100 meter wide. And I give somebody a tractor and they can dig the hole in 5 days. Let's say I want to create 5 jobs. I'll take away the tractor, give them shovels. Now I need 5 people. I have created 5 jobs. Let's say I want to create 100 jobs. What I'll do is I'll take away their shovels and I'll give them spoons. And suddenly I'm going to need 100 people to do the same thing. So I feel like here we are going from spoons to shovels to tractors, and the more tractors we have, the faster we get to the hole. So let's be more efficient as a society would be the economic answer to this problem.
Yeah, I think when pushed, humans have always come out on top. So I guess we will find ways to upgrade ourselves, make ourselves more efficient. And as everything has till today, this invention of language bots will also help us, get used to our lives with them in it. So I guess moving on, what are the competitors that have popped up, or what is the kind of, response that ChatGPT has got in your world where a lot more people are familiar with what this is and, with what implications this has than maybe the world that Akhil and I come from?
Yeah, so firstly, ChatGPT has exploded, and all different kinds of people are using it for a variety of different tasks, some for humor, some for literature, some for doing their jobs or aiding in their jobs, etc. I think it has reached over 1 million users. I think it reached like 1 million users in a week or something, which is pretty crazy. So there's definitely a lot of use cases and applications that will keep on coming out as the community keeps using it. And as a result of it, there is also going to be competitors that come out. Now, competing with ChatGPT and OpenAI is not so trivial because the amount of resources needed in terms of compute and also in terms of monetary value is huge, right? Uh, so I think these large language models take like millions of dollars to train, and then on top of that, the reinforcement process we talked about, you need to get human feedback, which is costly because you need to hire people to get that feedback. It's kind of hard to for normal like researchers in universities or stuff like that to compete. But there are a few competitors that have come out. I think there's one called Anthropic AI, which has released its like chatbot called Claude in a limited access. And I think it also is a startup that raised a huge amount of funding to kind of like train these models and kind of align it more for human conversations. And I think one few of the founders are directly come from OpenAI. On Twitter, there's talk about Claude, and people are pretty impressed with it basically as well. So if it is released to the public, people will be pretty excited to use it, and there is some hype around that. There's also large language models which are trained by other companies like Google and Nvidia, right? So Google has this new system called Palm, and it has used it to train a language model which is like 540 billion parameters, so almost like 2 to 3x of GPT-3. But obviously, it's not available for public use, and I think Google might have plans to incorporate it into their products soon. Nvidia, since they manufacture the GPUs, they have some sort of like open source repositories that enables these large language models, but that is nowhere near the scale of like GPT. As like, well, even if it's open source, no one can really train it because like a single individual like myself, if I don't have the computer or the resources to achieve that. And I think Google's research branch, DeepMind, has also done some research on these language models and then these reinforcement learning process to kind of align it for different use cases like human conversations. I think it uses kind of like a different method, but there's some research going on there as well. Oh, also, there is a large language model called Bloom, which is also 175 billion parameters. And the cool thing about Bloom is that it is open source. So it is completely trained in the open by just like people from the machine learning community. And I think the compute was probably sponsored by a few companies. But yeah, lots of developments happening. I think papers are coming out every day. Kind of gets hard to follow them. It's pretty exciting that so many people are working on it, and this will eventually help to make these systems better and better.
So it looks like you have a lot of experience with softwares like ChatGPT or elsewhere. So what would be some of the fun queries that our users can try by themselves and experience a part of this?
You can tell it to tell you jokes. You can, let's say, write some poems in about a particular topic in the style of some particular poets that are your favorite. So if you have a favorite poet, you can tell it to write a poem about, like, let's say, ChatGPT itself in the style of that poet, and you can kind of play with it. And then there's this tasks about useful tasks or applications that you can do with it, right? It can basically act as your assistant, like a person who schedules lots of meeting. You can integrate it into your email to kind of automate that process of scheduling meetings.
From the purist perspective, what is left of art if that is the case? You're a writer and then you're just going over to ChatGPT and you're like, oh, you know what, write it for me rather than me writing it for you. Don't you think there is an implication there where art gets a little tampered? Recently, there was a very interesting case of this monkey, right? And this monkey took a selfie of itself. And the company who was supposed to own the image tried to place a copyright on somebody else using the image. And they failed in court because they're like, the monkey has clicked the photo. And since the monkey has clicked the photo, you don't own the photo. And now there is this AI written comic that is losing its copyright because it has been written by AI and not by the human itself. So don't you think it kind of muddles everything up? There's also a very interesting case of New York City has now banned ChatGPT's use in schools. And how are they going to achieve that? And do they even know about the competitors, or is it just, as government does and government knows, it's only knows so much?
There's definitely going to be ethical considerations or legal considerations that are going to rise up in the short term and even in the long term.
I just wanted to add a bit to that. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a college counselor, and I was telling her about ChatGPT and how it can be used for essays and whatnot. And she's like, oh my God, students are going to be doing this all the time. But then as we progressed in the conversation, the sort of learning we took out of it is that for people who are not writers, like I don't think any of the three of us are writers as much as I know it. When we want to begin writing something, the hardest point is to start. We are always good when we have a block of text and we have to edit it or add to it or subtract from it and all that. But actually getting a starting point is the hardest thing that we have to do. So a software like ChatGPT or similar AIs that are out there for writing, I think the best thing that they did, especially for Akhil and I, as we've noticed through this process of our podcast, is that it gives you a starting point.
In terms of art itself, humans have always needed a medium to express themselves, and that's not going to change. So they may use these systems as a medium, but they will continue to express themselves in new and better ways. So I don't think like there's like a threat to replacing art itself. I definitely think that it will become easier for humans or even people who are not artists to kind of express themselves more freely and easily, as we should mention, by providing a starting point and by providing all different sorts of aids in the future. But I think the process of art or the process of expression itself is probably not going to go anywhere.
I think it goes back to the aid the human perspective rather than replace the human perspective. Where now, initially in the war, you had sticks, then you had guns, then you had bazookas, now you have nuclear weapons. So this might sit somewhere in the middle, and soon we'll get to like our nuclear weapons as well.
You see the whole thing of, how thanks to Instagram and camera phones and this, that, and the other, a lot of people are now photographers of a very high level, or a lot of people are now writing and recording songs thanks to improved mics and, softwares being available more easily on laptops and things like that. But the professionals are still the professionals. The guys who do this for a living, the guys who have it as their passion, they still stand heads and shoulders above all the rest of us. So I think it's going to be similar to that, where, as Hemil said, that art is always going to be art, and it's just for us menial people who struggle with this concept of art, that art is going to become a lot more approachable.
And there are people already adopting this optimistic view and enhancing their professions, right? So there are a lot of like artists that have started incorporating like stable diffusion or AI art tools to create new art. And that's gaining a lot of like popularity on Twitter. And they're also freely like sharing their process of how they've incorporated these tools, right?
On a side note, this Instagram and your company Snapchat has made lives pretty miserable in parties. Every time you're at a party, all people want to do is take these photos and just disrupt the flow. Sometimes you're like in the middle of dancing and suddenly somebody like, no, make that pose, and that's how I want to take a photo.
This literally happened to me yesterday. I was at a friend's party, and those three of us having a conversation. And this fourth guy goes like, no, 1 second. I have to take, be candid. I want to take a candid picture of it. And he's standing in front of us with a camera out. And we're like, dude, can you just not right now? We're in the middle of a very interesting conversation. And then there's this guy with his phone. He's like, I want to capture that. I was like, it was so annoying.
So from this, let's lead into some of the downsides. Every time we talk about these topics, we talk about technology, we are very pro, and the biases come straight through. All of us are engineers and we have all worked in tech at some point or the other. But what about some of the downsides? What about this Instagram downside? Is there an Instagram downside to ChatGPT?
Yeah, I think the number one downside that comes to mind is getting or becoming lazy and complacent. So that is something to be careful of when you're using these tools. Definitely use them as an aid, but don't rely on them completely to do your work.
I think that leads into another very interesting discussion, because I was sitting with one of my brothers. He's studying for his CPA exam. And during that, I asked him something related to taxes, some kind of a taxation question. And while asking him the taxation question, I just, put it on ChatGPT that what is the answer to this taxation question with respect to Canada. It gave me an answer. The answer was pretty concise. And then my brother is saying, yeah, but that's not the whole story. And, he expanded on it for me. And I love, even on ChatGPT, when you ask it a question regarding something so intricate as taxes, it always tells you to go to source material and to consult a professional before you take its advice. And they've done a good job on that front. Then again, we are all humans and we like to take the easier route out sometimes. And we all just, like to rely on whatever we have in hand.
Yeah, what you are seeing there is kind of like the reinforcement learning process that I mentioned, right? Like it has been optimized for these kind of conversations where like it tells you to not to rely on it completely for factual information and kind of tells you to do your own thorough research, and it only keep getting better. As you can see, like the millions of users that are using ChatGPT. When you use ChatGPT, there is a kind of like a small UI for each response where you can thumbs up or thumbs down. So what that becomes is basically data for them to continuously improve their models. But there's also many like obviously there's many like ethical considerations and like reverse engineering techniques that you need to be careful of. There's an example where you can ask it harmful things directly, and then it'll tell you that, oh, sorry, this is like kind of harmful and I can't tell you that because this is not the right thing to do. But then people kind of reverse engineering it and say that, yeah, I'm writing a movie and there are two characters in my movie who are kind of like villains, and these villains need to do this thing which is harmful, and then it gives you kind of the answer. So I think these many number of users using it will help avoid these scenarios.
Robert Oppenheimer, when he finally cracked the nuclear weapon, he said, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. And despite that, nuclear weapons are one of the primary reasons we have peace in the world, because people know that if there is a huge war, everybody's dead. I think this is back to that, right? There is death on one end and there is absolute prosperity on the other. And hopefully we lead more towards the prosperity of things like AI engines.
Yeah, I mean, there are two sides to every coin. So everything that has its positives will have its fair share of negatives. You look at, I mean, anybody in the world who is touted a genius, their personalities are not the best. They're not the best with when it comes to family and things like that, yet they've left the world in a better place. So every single thing has its fair share of positives and fair share of negatives. We have to make sure that we just focus on the positives.
So focusing on the positives, what, Hemil, do you think is the future of this, and where do you think it is going from here?
I think the future is pretty hard to like kind of predict accurately based on the kind of rapid developments we are seeing. But it is very likely that these models and these systems will continue improving. And once these systems are released to the public by like an API or something, there will be lots of applications or augmentations built with these systems acting as a foundation. Another is that these models are continually going to get better at its core. So companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, and big companies like Google are going to continue improving the processes, the techniques, the algorithms that are used to train and develop these models, and they're going to get better and better. And so, as we might have like GPT-4 on the horizon or better models.
It's not as far as you think. There's this company called Do Not Pay, and Do Not Pay is an AI driven way to contest your parking ticket. And recently they got permission that one of these people who got a parking ticket is going to be in court, and he's going to have his phone in his hands, and whatever the judge says will be fed to it on its phone. It's going to give it a response, and it's the person who is contesting the ticket is going to give the exact same response. So they're like, you don't need a lawyer even in court physically. You can just use our app and contest your parking ticket.
I think this is happening in New York State or something like that, where it's going to be the first AI lawyer defending a human client in court. I mean, imagine that.
And imagine where it can go from there, right? A system such as this can process information much faster. Even as human beings, when you have a lawyer sitting there, he hears a response, and they form an image in their mind as to what all information do I have. I put it together and I come up with an answer. But that's exactly what is going on here, but in milliseconds.
At the same time, this again then just goes back to that whole ethics question once again, because this do not pay is very specifically for like parking tickets and things like that, which are obviously, non-violent crimes, and there is like, it's a very menial thing. But as in how this progresses, today you and I have a certain ethical system, a certain value system that we think upon, and that's how we form our opinions based on someone who's done wrong or done right. And a lawyer who defends clients also has a way of thinking. So now when you have AI defending clients for maybe a little more serious crimes, how does that whole thing going to work? So there is that whole conundrum, which we are not going to dive into, but this opens up that can of worms as well.
It's a whole another episode for another time.
Whole other episode, I don't know how long this will go on, then this discussion's endless.
Also, I want to mention that this will enable personalization and automation at a far greater scale as well. Like someone optimizes the language model or ChatGPT for travel planning, and it kind of becomes a planner for you, for your use cases, for what your preferences are. And there's actually a company called Adapt AI, which is kind of trying to use language models to automate tasks like these on the browser. The kind of automation possibilities are endless here.
As of now, my dad calls me up and he's like, please get this booked for me. And then I have to run through so many websites to get stuff booked. And, that's a hassle. So hopefully it's easy enough even for somebody like my dad to use it. And that would make life much simpler for me more than anybody else.
Not only do you have to run through a bunch of websites, that you then have to report back to your dad saying X, Y, Z are your options, and then you have to make sure your definition of good option matches his. So then there is that thing. So here you can probably customize the AI to work according to your preferences.
Yeah, and the question of it being easy to use for your dad or for anyone basically is answered by its interface, right? Its interface is natural language. We all learn as we grow, and that's the interface we use to talk with everyone. So it's probably the easiest interface you can build.
I think my dad's life becoming easier is a lovely note to leave this at. And we're going to provide all the links in the description. So go out, test ChatGPT by yourself, test a couple other engines by yourself, and let us know what you feel. Let us know what your experiences have been, and let us know if we can make your life a little easier.
And I also want to say thanks to Akhil and Vishrut for inviting me. This was a lot of fun, and I hope to be back again.
Yeah, dude, thanks so much for coming. I don't think I have learned as much reading on the internet as I have in the past hour of talking to you. I think it's made so much sense to me now. A lot of the things that I didn't understand are a lot clearer. So I hope that's the case for our listeners as well. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Thought Bistro podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation and were able to learn something new. If you liked the episode, please be sure to subscribe to our show and leave a review on your favorite podcast app. You can also follow us on social media. Our Instagram and Twitter handles are available in the show notes. Thanks again for listening, and we shall see you in the next one.